Hi, I'm Pat Stewart from Hames and Axel Farm, and welcome to Goat Keeping 101, beginning goat keeping. And for this particular class, we're going to be going over what we're going to cover in the rest of the classwork. Um, every class is set up so that there is going to be a classroom session like this that I will send to you, and then a Zoom chat session on Thursdays at 9 o'clock. This particular class is an overview of what we're going to cover for the rest of the time and an introduction to goats in general, and also an introduction to me. So, we may as well get started. Um, I really like to teach in terms of a chat system, so it's hard for me to just talk at you continually. So, bear with me, but I will try to keep it on topic and we'll get on going. Okay, my name is Pat. Excuse me as I readjust. And Hames and Axel Farm is my Nigerian dwarf goat farm in Ashford Hammond, Massachusetts. I've been breeding Nigerians since about 1996. And before that, I was a park ranger and a museum interpreter and a tour guide. So my focus has always been education, and that still remains to this day. Although my specialty has become teaching people where their food comes from, and particularly about goats. Excuse my wonderful studio, but we're in the process of trying to get the attic fixed. So now you can see that I only have so much drywall behind me. Um, I did grow up in the city, and my father grew up on a farm. Both my sister and I now raise livestock on our own farms in eastern part of the country. My farm is in north central Massachusetts, which is kind of the forgotten region of the state. But it's a place that has affordable land, and so that's why I'm here. We started Hames and Axel to teach kids how farms fit into their lives. We had a traveling program where, by topic, I didn't do a petting zoo. I still don't do petting zoos, but I had segments on dairying and fiber and eggs and poultry and energy and history on the farm. And for dairying, a cow was not practical, so I needed to find a goat that was practical. And that's how I discovered the Nigerian dwarf goat. I needed a goat that could easily go into a crate and go into a school. My first goat that I got was not necessarily best suited for that, but she launched me on the career. Her name was Onyx, and she had not been handled a whole lot. She didn't really like me. She kind of always tolerated me, but she never hurt me and she never hurt anybody else. But she didn't really like being milked by strangers. Um, so I learned as I went along. Unfortunately, Hames and Axel, the educational program, started up about the same time the standardized testing happened in the country, and Massachusetts relegated agriculture to 1 week in kindergarten. And being 5 years old is a good time to learn a cow from a goat, from a horse, from a tractor, but it's not really a good time to learn about biological processes and soil health and all the things that really go into understanding our food system. So I'm now doing that as well as raising goats and making soap. And my goat's milk goes to my family's use as well as our soap making operation, which is called Surfing Goat Soaps. So we decided to stop trying to fight the tide and stop teaching after a few years and focused on breeding the goats and learning to make soap. And now we've got the soap part down. We're always learning on the breeding goat part. I'm back to teaching again. And because of COVID, there's been a real need. I mean, I've seen it for a long time, but a real need now for people to understand how our food system works, what food does for us, the right and wrong ways to raise food, and how, as a consumer, you have choices. And one of the things that people are choosing is to actually either source from the farm or have the farm themselves. And as a result, goats are becoming very interesting to people. A lot of people think they could just get a goat to get milk. You have to have a girl goat, and she has to have a baby most of the time. A rare thing can happen called a precocious udder, that a goat starts giving milk before her baby's born, but that's very rare. It's not something you should count on. So I'm getting a lot of calls for people who want goats. They want pet goats. They want browse control. They want them to entertain them. Goats make great friends. They really do bond to you. And as a result, you need to think about how long you're going to want to have them. Because if you're going to get tired after 2 years, they're going to live for another 10 to 15 years. So what's going to happen to them? Think about that before you get your goats. So why are goats so interesting to people? I've kind of been wondering that recently. What was the change? When I was a kid, my father would tell me about the farm, and I asked him one day if he had goats, and he said, no, nobody has goats. My dad lived through the Depression, and goats were considered the poor man's cow. Only poor people had goats because cows took a lot more to feed. Cows are a lot more dependent than goats are. Goats are naturally, they're kind of like a cat in that they will fend for themselves. They just won't necessarily ask permission. So I've begun to value that the goats have curiosity, and the goats like challenge. And I love that the goats are my friends. They come running when they see me. But I actually have come to value the milk, which I was taught was terrible tasting. And for me, Nigerian dwarf goat is the breed that I have. It's the breed that I want to drink their milk from. Other people like different flavors. Different breeds have different flavors. And the flavor actually also is dependent upon what stage of lactation, whether she's just had her kids or whether she had her kids 6 months ago, what food is available for her to eat. Is she living just off hay and no grain? Is she living near a buck? Is she living in a clean space? All of those things affect the flavor. So the other thing that affects the flavor is age. Goat milk will get tangier and stronger with time. Also with heat management. So if it's pasteurized, it will be tangier. It will be a little buckier. That's the flavor we call it. It's also the same sense in your mouth if you get around an attacked male goat, a buck. He is quite a strong fellow in his smell, and it passes into the milk of the does that live near him. And anybody who says that doesn't is not drinking their milk or just really appreciates the smell and the taste on their own. Some people do. I don't. So people have really become interested in the goats because they're more manageable. Nigerians allow them to have them in urban areas, in backyards. They do make you laugh. They do make you feel good. But they also have the downsides of goats are very hard to contain. That's the biggest problem with them. You have to give them lots of entertainment inside their pen so they don't feel like they are bored and need to go explore. You need to keep your fences tight or they will climb them or jump them. And they are prone to predators because even with horns, if you leave the horns on them, they still don't have a lot to protect themselves. Their main way of protecting themselves would be to put themselves in the middle of the herd and let a weaker goat get eaten. So that's another reason you need to have at least two. A goat that lives alone feels threatened constantly. They are lonely and they're scared. And that will drive them crazy. It will make them aggressive. So you should not have one goat only. And I don't think they should live in the house, but that's just me. We just are not goats. They are not people. And they need to live among their own. Doesn't mean we can't enjoy them and spend time with them. But they are eventually going to grow up to be very stubborn, smart things that get easily bored, which doesn't usually go well in a house. The other thing that's difficult about them is if you want to have them, you need to have access to a buck, which does mean that smell is going to be around. And the other thing is veterinary care. Goats are not generally taught in vet schools in this country. It's getting better. But until 20 years ago, goats really were just something that people thought were funny looking sheep. They really weren't something that the vet studied. When my first doe that was born to us had her first babies, I took her to a guy who said he was about 6'3", 6'4", looked a little bit like David Letterman, and my goat was 20 inches tall. And thankfully, Dr. Davini walked up and said, I had goats in college, so I know what I'm doing. And he put his hand in there and checked the cervix and said that does not even in labor yet. Well, she was in pre-labor, and she did deliver within 45 minutes after we got home. But at that point, I saw what he did and said, if he can do that, I can do that. And that's what he wanted me to know. But the fact that he had goats himself, he knew that most vets weren't trained on that he had his own personal experience. So if you can find a vet that has goat experience, stick with them. They're invaluable. If you don't have a vet that has goat experience, if you can't find that, your next best bet is to find an old fogey like me, a goat mentor. And if you've got a good one, she will say, or he will say, like I do, you need to call a vet. Because we're not veterinarians, but we know how to help through a lot of things that a goat vet would be able to help you through, but with a much higher price tag. So that's your other downside of keeping the goats. The good side is you've got milk, you've got browsing, you've got weed control, you've got manure for your gardens, you've got smiles every morning. You probably have friends who come over to see the goats. You may have some neighbors who aren't happy if your goats get out, so you better make sure your fencing stays tight. But there are a lot of good, wonderful things about keeping goats, but there are some downsides too. And one of them is that they don't live 80 years. So you will have to deal at some point in time with an ailing elderly goat if you're in it long enough. So all of this that I've been talking about is general goat information. And the rest of this class is really going to focus on the Nigerian. But some of it is a goat is a goat is a goat, regardless of whether it's a meat goat or a full-size dairy goat or a Nigerian dwarf goat or a pygmy goat or a grade, which means a mutt. A goat is a goat is a goat. The management just needs to be scaled accordingly to the breed. So one of the things that we need to think about first when managing for the goats is their digestive tract. They have a ruminant digestive tract, which is the same as cows and goats, llamas, sheep. And that means they have 4 chambers. We sometimes say 4 stomachs, but they don't each act the same. It's 4 chambers. So it's the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum, and the abomasum. And each one of those has a different role to play. But what happens is the goat will actually chew up a little bit, swallow some of the food to the reticulum, which actually adds some moisture, grinds it up, and then they'll kick it back up to their stomach, up to their mouth, chew some more. That's called cutting or ruminating. Then they'll swallow it down to the second chamber, which is really the most pivotal chamber that we worry about. It's called the rumen, and it actually has a little society of microbes that live in that gut that are very, very important. They break down the cell wall from the plant matter that we as omnivores have trouble breaking down and carnivores cannot break down. So the microfauna actually, they live off that cell wall proteins, and they help break down and secrete the nutrients that the goat needs, and which will pass on through the 3rd and 4th chambers, the omasum and the abomasum, before they actually are excreted. So it takes 2 to 3 days for a goat to finish its meal. But if that rumen doesn't work because we killed off all of the bacteria in there, then the whole system doesn't work. And one of the things that happens is a goat can get bloat. And bloat is where the bacteria in the gut get really, really happy, and they make a big gassy foam, and they stop everything from working. And because a goat makes much of its own nutrition, one of the really important things that it makes is it needs to have vitamin B, which is thiamine. Thiamine is needed for the brain. So if the rumen's not working, the brain can't function. If the brain can't function, the rest of the goat will die. So as easy, as simple in keeping our goats healthy is to make sure that their gut is healthy. They're eating healthy food. They're not eating poisonous food. They're not getting too many sugars. Most of their diet is considered browse. It's hay, it's forage, it's brush, it's bark. It's not grain. And we love them to death sometimes when we feed them too much grain. When an animal is sick and needs antibiotics, that antibiotic can just as easily kill or damage that rumen flora. So we try to avoid those antibacterials as much as we can. If we have to give them an antibiotic, then we should also think about making sure they get yogurt or probios or yeast or brewer's yeast, something to help them build that microflora back up in the gut, or they won't be healthy. So that is common to all goats regardless of their size. Their behavior, that they need to be in groups, that is common to all of them. Fear is common to all of them. Curiosity is common to all of them. And so is friendship. They will make friends, and they will make friends with you. They will bond to you like a dog does. They will come they will learn to come when you call them. All of those things are what we have to consider when we get goats. Can we manage more than one? Can we provide enough food for all of them all the time? Can we give them time? If they're browse goats, then they don't need to have a lot of human companionship because they've got other goats' companionship. But if they're pets and you're home 2 hours a week and there's only 2 of them, that's really not enough time for them to be healthy and happy. And so the other thing we have to think about is the nutrition. The fact that we need to make sure that we have access to the forage. They have access to exercise. So those all are, a goat is a goat is a goat. Those are things you all have to think about regardless of what breed you get. Why are people so interested now? It's partly because they want control. They really are fearful at this point that our food system is not working the way it should be. Our food is not as nutritious as it should be, and that they want to be able to play around with cheeses and alternative meats and yogurts and things like that. There's a little curiosity as to traditional arts. Also, there's the fact that goats are easier on the planet than most other species. They don't compress the soil because they're not that big, although they will in time. My fences were all set to be right at the top of the ground when we first built this place. And 10 years later, there was a nice 2-inch gap that they had trounced down. So we just had to reestablish the fence down there. But in general, if they have adequate exercise and space, they're not going to compact your soil the way a herd of cattle would or a herd of horses. People they're kind of yearning for a sense of personal responsibility with their food, but also they want connection. And the internet has been like the goat's best friend because people see how silly they are and they want that silliness in their lives. It has also been their worst enemy because it's made them attractive to people who really shouldn't have goats. So, most of this class is focused specifically on the Nigerian, and this next class is going to be about the history of the breed. But the history of the species goes back with humans over 6,000, over 8,000 years. The goat in general was one of the first animals domesticated. They learned very quickly that people would take care of them. They learned to appreciate being petted and stroked and loved. And a goat will carry for you as a pack goat would. It will give you milk as a dairy goat. It will give you friendship. And when it's dead or when you need it, it will feed you with meat. And then it will clothe you with its wool, either its wool if it's an Angora, or its meat, its pelt. It was any other breed. So they were very practical animals. They did not need a lot of tending. I mean, the shepherd would, or the goat herd would actually go out and mainly just keep the predators away, just be a guard dog. The goats themselves, they can get themselves into trouble, but they can also usually get themselves out of trouble. Not always, but usually. So they became very popular. There are two different breakdowns of goats. There's the ones from Africa, which are the Nigerian, the Nubian, and the Pygmy. And then there's the ones from Europe, which are the Sonnens and the Alpines, the Oberhaslis, the Toggenburgs. The La Mancha is actually based upon that, but the La Mancha is actually an American breed. So the African goats can be bred year round, and they have higher butterfat content. The Nubian, actually, which is the largest of all of the dairy breeds, has a good amount of milk production as well as a high butterfat content. The Nigerian has a higher butterfat content, but smaller amounts of milk. So you decide what breed you want. I focused on the Nigerian because I wanted something that was easy to handle, easy to transport, easy to milk. And then once I tasted the milk, I didn't want anything else. So that's why I focused on the Nigerian. We're going to talk in the next class about how that was expanded into developing an entire breed. And then the rest of the class will be focused specifically on the Nigerian dwarf goat, on its scale of operation, the challenges and the benefits that it offers. And so that will all start up next week. So take a look. If you want more of the classes, they're available. I will be sending out a book to the one person so far who has bought the entire series. You can also buy the book at lulu.com. It's $25 in print. It's $10 in a download. And then I will see you all this coming Thursday for the chat on Zoom. Okay? So that's our introduction to goats. Let's get back next week with Nigerians. Okay? Take care and stay well. Thanks. Bye.